Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you. For those who don't know me, I'm Ewan Leach. I'm the Chief Executive of SURF Scotland Regeneration Forum, and welcome to our People in Place network. I think today's event is a combination of people who are signed up to the network, who may not be SURF members, and our membership as well. If you're not a member, please join. If you're not a member, I might have to disregard your opinion. I'm joking. We're interested in everyone's opinion this morning because you're all interested in regeneration. So the purpose of today is a bit different from our previous people in place networks, which are often looking at an example of a policy in practice. They are looking at action that's taking place on the ground, whether it is working or whether it's not working, and looking at good case studies or looking at overarching strategic issues that are affecting communities across Scotland. But today is a bit different because we are looking at the SURF Manifesto in advance of the 2026 Scottish election. And I suppose it should be noted that the majority of this work was done in the close of 2024, and it was our former colleague Derek Rankin, who was the policy officer at SURF until February this year, who did most of the work on our manifesto. And he and I did a series of about 25 meetings with people within the network and beyond to look at what people's priorities were. That resulted in a paper which I think you've all received. And after that, we then used both our expert advisory group. We shared it with them and had an afternoon's session with them. And then at the shared learning events in May, where we look at the SURF Awards from 2024. At the end of each of those events, we would look at a specific theme and discuss that with the audience there and to see if they had anything different that came out at those events. So our plan had been to maybe have our manifesto kind of published in August, but with Derek leaving in February, we've kind of pushed that back a bit. And our conference has also been pushed back. It's now on March the 12th. In 2026, which is much closer to the election and brings a delightful bit of tension to all because we'll maybe have a better idea of what is in manifestos by then. And it's also an opportunity for us to host hustings in advance of the election. It'd be an early hustings, but nonetheless, we think it is an opportunity to hear from parties as to what their agendas will be that are of particular interest to SURF's membership and SURF's audiences. But the purpose of today is just a general discussion for us to kind of find out more from this network is to see if there's anything major missing, I suppose, and to give you sort of heads up as to the direction of where we're heading with the manifesto and why we are maybe heading in the direction that we are. So you'll be aware that the SURF Awards well, actually, I suppose before I talk about the SURF Awards, I should probably share, what is the purpose of SURF, what's SURF's agenda? And I suppose SURF's agenda is very, very simple. It's about improving the lives and opportunities for the most disadvantaged people in Scotland. So regeneration can sometimes be about making nice places nicer. That's a great thing, but that's not SURF's purpose. We're looking at the most disadvantaged places and we're about looking at improving the lives and opportunities of the people who live in those places. And it's through a holistic approach to place. So we look at all sorts of things around a place, the physical and social, economic and cultural activities that take place within neighbourhoods and communities in Scotland. And the fundamental underlying thing to that is that the communities have to be at the heart of the decision making. They have to have a meaningful role within the decision making about what's going to happen around them, about the decisions that are taking place. So these are the kind of drivers for SURF. And it's through those drivers that we began looking at our manifesto. And because of the SURF Awards fall into 5 categories: community-led, improving whole places, creative regeneration, housing and regeneration, and employability, we framed our meetings around those 5 topics because those are the 5 topics that we look at the most. And to a degree, you could say that SURF is a little bit like it's everything everywhere all at once, which is kind of then mammoth because we want everything to be good for everybody. And that's a big ask and obviously would require more than just a one organisation manifesto. And so you'll see if you've had a good read of the stage one research that Derek and I did, and it was written up by Derek, um, you'll see there's tones that come through, and because of the time that we undertook this bit of research, and it was prior to the sort of budget announcements in sort of the autumn of 2024, and I would say things were looking particularly bleak economically at that point. And a lot of the discussions I would say were reflecting on that fact. So people were feeling particularly pessimistic about the future, both for them, for their organizations individually, and for the situations that they were trying to address, and wider economic issues that were looking like they were on the horizon. After the budget, I would say the tone changed ever so slightly. The budget wasn't as harsh as people were expecting, because I think the incoming government had obviously done a lot of talk about how bad the situation was that they're going to have to address to undo the previous government's work, or lack of work. And so there was a slight change in tone, but nonetheless, I would say the issues remained the same. And so while we began looking at the various topics, there were underlying issues that we think were cutting across all of the organizations that we were meeting with. And when we met with organizations, we were meeting with small voluntary groups, charity groups, some private organizations, and also some local authorities as well. So we were cutting across as many different sizes of organization as possible. And as a result of that, we began the whole issue of everything everywhere all at once kind of was becoming a bit more prevalent. And it's that we can't do everything everywhere all at once, and we can't have a manifesto that's just saying we want absolutely everything. But we also began looking at some of the underlying drivers for what some organizations were then having to deal with. And ultimately, a lot of organizations, including SURF, are looking at mitigating poverty. Um, so as long as we have poverty, the organizations have to exist. And I suppose a lot of us may work in organizations that we don't want the organization to exist because we don't want poverty to exist. But the poverty exists, so we're doing things that can ameliorate or soften some of the terrible consequences of people living in poverty. So that was one thing that sort of is prevalent through a lot of the meetings that we had with people, that if we don't address poverty, we will continue to have to kind of be doing emergency work for those worst affected by poverty in our communities. But we began then looking at things, what are things that organizations that are focused on creativity or employability, what other things are they having to deal with? And I would say there are four things that we are looking at putting into our manifesto, which are not necessarily four things that SURF has as SURF awards, but they are things that are affecting people who are working around SURF's areas. So the four things that we're beginning to look at, and I don't think any of them will come as any surprise because they are basic and they're often fundamentals to life. But the first one is housing and the housing crisis. Or housing emergency, however we want to label it. I think a lot of local authorities have accepted it as a housing crisis. But you can see from a number of comments from the interviews we had that organizations were having to deal with people who were experiencing a housing emergency or homelessness. And we know from both Scottish Government stats and works of the umbrella organisations for housing associations that there's a waiting list of 250,000 people for social housing in Scotland, which I think of that 10,000 children are living in poverty. You know, the stats around it are high. And as a result, the people who are working in other aspects of regeneration are having to deal with those poor housing issues. So as a result, we think the housing emergency will be part of it. And our take on it will not be, we just need lots and lots of houses. We do need lots and lots of houses, but we specifically need a lot of social housing so that it is genuinely affordable. Affordable housing is obviously important, but the most disadvantaged people are people who need social housing, so they need a lower rent than the affordable rent, which is just 80% of your average rent. So it's social housing that we'll be focusing on as an ask, but also the retrofit agenda around social and affordable housing. And then within that, this is where everything all at once, everywhere kind of comes into it. it's not just houses that we need. We need houses within communities, but we will likely also need new communities to exist. And it has to be housing that comes with things that come under the Living Well local policy in National Planning Framework 4. So housing that comes with services and schools, if you're looking at a community of a certain size. So ones that people can live their day-to-day lives in and access affordable food, etc., health services within that as well. So it would be it's a housing crisis with the services that need to go with that. Um, it's in some ways it's a bit of a no-brainer because the housing crisis is apparent in most people's work. So whatever you're doing, you'll become aware of that. And connected to the housing emergency is the local transport issues. So transport is not one particular thread that SURF looks at, but public transport is one that affects most behaviours that apply to things that SURF is interested in. So access to employment, access to culture and creativity, if it's not within your own community. And it's the transport issue is Scotland wide. Both housing and transport are issues that are not urban issues. They are national issues. They are affecting communities, whether they're urban or rural. And while there are some good things that have happened in Scotland around transport, um, free travel for over 60s and free travel for 21 and under, the service has to exist for it to be of use. And what our interviews are revealing is that for a lot of communities out with urban centres and even within some urban centres, the transport doesn't exist for young or older people to use at a frequency or at a time at a late night for them to be using that free transport where it to exist. So the transport is exacerbating a sort of existing crisis. And the Living Well policy, locally policy, is a good policy, but I think we all can recognize we're not going to get every single community having all aspects of health and social and cultural services delivered directly within their communities because of the size of community and the affordability of that for all of us as a nation to deliver that. But the transport then gives us access to it. And the Living Well policy, I think the first bullet point in that planning policy is access to public transport. So the public transport is deeply connected to the housing crisis and the access to mobility to find work and to find people and to enjoy social aspects of our lives as well, and to access health facilities as well. Because obviously, health facilities that are in specialisms can be concentrated in certain places. So housing and transport are two of the big agendas that we'll be saying that without addressing these, people working within regeneration will be forever responding to the deeply negative things that people are experiencing in their communities because they don't have adequate housing or transport. So these are two kind of, in some ways, place-based aspects of the manifesto that we'll be looking at. The next two items that we'll be probably putting in the manifesto are ones that we also say they are applicable across all of Scotland, and they are the fairer funding agenda and democracy matters agenda. So they are both existing agendas. You could say fairer funding is really led on by Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, and the fairer funding agenda is, again, if you read through the research in phase one of that we carried out, the funding is the thing that all organisations are talking about. Availability of funding, timescales, criteria, capital versus operational, they are all the things that all of our correspondents talked to us about. The difficulty of managing that. Short timescales for funding becoming available, with projects having to be delivered within very tight timescales, being a challenge in itself. Changing funding programs within fairly short periods of time, meaning that it's a complex landscape. And also, I think, I know that this wasn't through one of our interviews, but being at a conference and somebody who's worked in employability for 20 years, and she said she's delivered about 10 different schemes, but they've all been the same scheme, but they get dressed up as something different, and she said it creates unnecessary work. So it's that kind of long-term patient funding, committed funding to communities, and to organizations that are working within communities so that they can make that difference. So that's necessary, whether or not we address the housing and transport issues. The fairer funding issue is one that we think is incredibly important. There are challenges around that. There was an event yesterday well, there were two events yesterday. One was a sort of collaborative SURF event, and the other one was a social enterprise event. And the aspect of fairer funding, and one of the challenges around that is if funders of all sorts go to longer term funding, they may narrow how many organizations they fund, and that's obviously wouldn't be totally satisfactory. But we need clarity around what the fairer funding model looks like. And SAVO are working on that so that we're not saying we want less funding. We want a quantity of funding that was committed to places over a long period of time to address these issues. And obviously, from our perspective, we're wanting to make sure not that the jam is spread thinly across all of Scotland, but that the jam is spread to the places that are most disadvantaged. And that obviously needs careful consideration because it plays out differently within urban, and the evidence and stats play out differently in urban and rural Scotland, but it's certainly one that we think is crucially needs pushed forward within the government of the next parliament. And the final point is around democracy matters. As I think I said at the end, one of SURF's agendas is that communities are at the heart of decision making. So nothing for us without us. And so the Democracy Matters program is something that is bubbling along for the past couple of years. We're at Democracy Matters 2. I think we will expect to see something more coming out in the near future on the government's recommendations around what that looks like. But whatever that recommendation is, the next government has to really take local democracy seriously, invest and resource in it, and make sure it's happening at a meaningful level within communities so that people from all backgrounds within their communities can participate in their local democracy so that they can guide the decision making that is happening around them. As I said, they're not rocket science, but we think there are four fundamental things that are, in not addressing them, are driving unfair behaviours, unfair and particularly unfair and unequal outcomes for communities across Scotland. And we think that while we could put in our manifesto narrower things and more niche things specific to our you could say our five categories, we think that would not give credit to the fact that there are much deeper issues within Scottish society that need to be addressed so that we don't need to be permanently living in the regeneration game of regenerating communities every 20 to 30 years. We need to go deeper than that and make sure that we're not having to experience the regeneration programs that we are, where we see the same communities being regenerated because we have done something. We've done a big capital project and then 30 years later, we've not maintained it. So that all ties into issues kind of around housing and the whole place approach. So these are the kind of four things that we're looking at: housing, transport, public transport, fairer funding, and democracy matters. I'm interested in your feedback on it now. What I would say is we know that within our network there are a lot of single issue agendas that people have, and there are very specific things that have come up. And I think particularly when we did the shared learning workshops, there were things that came up in that were very specific, which we think are necessary. So one example for that was in our employability workshop, issues around both the lack of teachers of English as a second language and the lack of interpreters was proving a barrier to working with some new communities that have moved to Scotland. And we think that is an important issue. We don't think it's a manifesto issue, but we think we're aware of it being an issue. So there are things that have come up in conversation with some groups. And I know, I suppose today, and can see Scottish Community Alliance's bulletins just come out today, and the response to the Good Food Nation program has come out. And obviously, we did a conference on community growing a couple of years ago. Again, that's really important to us. We see that's really important as part of the housing issue, when you're looking at a holistic place to creating housing, to have community growing space. But for SURF, it's not going to be one of the fundamental things that we're asking for, but it will be implicit, and we may spell some things out within some of the asks that we're making up of these four particular agendas. So we're open to any feedback from you as a network that we've met with regularly over the past 2 years, or it's 2 or 3 years, as it began at the 20-minute neighborhood network. But we're very open to having responses from you. It's a open conversation. We'd ask you to be civil and polite. Some of the issues that we're not that we're saying don't criticize us, although I would say I've been off work with a chest infection for a week, so treat me kindly. I'm on antibiotics. But we're open to kind of having an open discussion about this. But the direction that we're seeing this going in is that these things really need to be addressed for other things to benefit. And I would say that one of the reasons that we also have picked some of those things is because there are issues that have cropped up as well, no matter what the size of the organization is. So the fairer funding issue is very often seen as a kind of voluntary sector issue, but we know that within local authorities, it's a major issue as to how local authorities are funded, how their projects are funded, how their timescales are funded, are then affected by decision making, and how their staffing is also handled, and that people are brought in for short-term project-based work, which also creates job insecurity in itself. So even within the public sector, we think some of these things are crucial. Our advisory group, one of the things which was talked about was issues around tourism and around community-led tourism, but we're also aware that without social housing within rural areas in Scotland, we can't really service the tourist industry either. So housing is a crisis within our small communities. And I think I've referred to this before, but there are sort of well-known restaurants on main roads in Scotland who have had to reduce their opening hours because they can't get staff, because the staff have no accommodation within the area, because we've shifted our accommodation into actually just for the tourists without being able to serve the tourists. So we're really trying to look at the issues that undercut a lot of the things that are of interest to our members that they are delivering, but we think these need addressed to help support these organizations. So if you've got anything to say, raise your hand, and we're welcome to look forward to hearing what you have to say. I've removed the spotlight so that I can see you all. Okay, David Bryan.
Yeah, apologies, my camera's fighting with Zoom, but
Right.
yeah, look, I think a key challenge, and it's a cross-cutting theme, if you like, is the crisis facing volunteering. Um, there are various figures out there, but they're all concordant. They all say the same story, which is that volunteering is just declining from about low 30s% of the population before COVID to 20 high teens at the moment. SCVO figures were that it's about 18% of the population, and it's declining at 4% per annum. And what that means is that a £2.3 billion industry, if the current trends continue, will be absent altogether in 4.5 years. Now, that's not going to happen, but there is a huge crisis here, because volunteering is propping up society. It's propping up the economy. It's not about nice, frilly things that people might think of. It's not just about litter picking or goodness knows what. This is about maintaining people in their homes. And this is about getting people to hospital appointments. This is about all sorts of things. It's a huge crisis, and Scottish society is hanging by a thread if volunteering continues to decline at the current level.
And so I would agree, and I think we know that volunteering within deprived communities is lower than the average, because obviously people have a huge amount on their plate as it is. But that crisis in volunteering, and what would you say the drivers are for it being a crisis?
I think there are many drivers. More people having to work more of the time. I think that there's perhaps a reduction in the sense of community. Think some of the things that have been inspiring volunteering over the years, like Duke of Edinburgh, have become less prevalent in schools. Um, I think it's mostly the financial situation that people can't afford to give of their time. Um, the one thing that really concerned me, it was an excellent session at SUV at the gathering, was that the First Minister gave a terrific input, as he always does, but he was completely unaware of this decline in volunteering. That concerns me because he should know, but even if he doesn't know, his civil servant should know and should have briefed him at an event that he's speaking at, which is SCVOV for volunteering. So there is a lack of awareness in government about this.
Yeah, I think I was aware. I wasn't at it, but I heard that he had been unaware of that fact, which again I would agree is a problem in itself. And I think you touched there on the cost of living crisis, which I suppose is implicit in what we're saying here. But the cost of living crisis is obviously this huge thing, and it's driven by energy. And I think the papers this morning are saying that by the end of the year they're looking at a 6% inflationary rate on food. Which is an issue in itself, and so is then driving behaviors and driving other behaviors and making it more difficult for people to volunteer. So thanks for the comment. That's something that I can take on board as a consequence of the other things that we're maybe looking at. Jonathan.
Yeah, hi. Following on from that, I think the crisis around volunteering, certainly within a social housing sector, is led sometimes by our inability as a sector to perhaps work in better partnership with our local community organisations. But for me, what's been really challenging is the lack of partnership working between housing associations. So, we're trying to deliver projects and we're trying to get volunteers. It's all ours. When, for instance, in my area, you've got 3 or 4 very active, very good housing associations, but we're not always great at bringing what we're doing together and perhaps sharing. And I think, so having a manifesto is amazing because you have to have a starting point, but I think there needs to be a little bit of a cultural, perhaps, shift, certainly within social housing around, this very protective, this is my project for my tenants, and, forgetting sometimes that my tenants live in their community with other tenants and other people, and so that's the challenge that I find really hard. And of course, if you look at volunteering, how that's affected through lack of people wanting to volunteer, because there's no sort of, I say there is no, I'm not seeing very much synergy around the sharing of volunteers. But also with funding, we've been much more successful in identifying, applying, and then getting funding, where we're doing that in partnership with other housing associations, our Energy FI service, welfare benefit service. They're all being delivered within a partnership framework. And what we don't do really well, we look at those core housing services and we do that, but we don't really think about applying that sort of method to the regeneration and engagement of our tenants and local communities. So they're just a couple of thoughts and a couple of the challenges that I face, and it may be different for other people, but yeah, just want to share that.
Okay, thanks very much, Jonathan. I mean, everyone wants to collaborate, and collaboration is difficult when you're doing it sort of genuinely, but I take on board what you're saying, and I obviously know where you're based and where our office is based, and so know the kind of ecology of the housing associations in that area. So I can take on board what you're saying, and you're saying that it is working successfully in one aspect, but that can be broadened out for other aspects of services that housing associations deliver. Okay, thank you very much. Any other comments from anybody else?
Sorry, Ewan, I can't find my hand up switch.
Don't worry, go ahead.
Jean from Scotland's Housing Network.
Thanks, Jean.
Unfortunately, Andrea couldn't be here today, but she's given me just a couple of throw-ins. The first one was, and it's a one-liner basically, need to avoid fuel poverty at all costs. And the second one is, social tenants should not be the ones expected to foot the bill for innovation through increased rents. Because you've covered everything else that Andrea had given me a note of. So those were the 2 things that she had mentioned.
Okay, Jean, that's really helpful. And I would say um, within the spheres in which we are interested in in that issue of the fuel poverty is one that we're highly aware of, and the cost being passed on to tenants is something that we're also very aware of, that that's not acceptable. And it's um, it, within the climate agenda, which is obviously huge and existential and important, we think the explanation of applying that in other ways is we're addressing fuel poverty. We want people's daily bills to be low, so that it is affordable for them to live in the house in which they live, and it will also be something that is hopefully mitigating climate change. But the driver for it should be improving the quality of the life of the people, the affordability of the life of the people who live there. And your second aspect is also very valid. And I know that Tony Kane from Alacho, he has concerns with the social tenants being experimented on around some of the retrofit agenda, because the quantity that exists within social housing allows you to do things at scale. And he has concerns that they remain the guinea pigs for a lot of technologies, which we've done historically. You can see it happening around rack, which has turned out to be a technology which was not very good. And so there are consequences when you experiment, because you may not know the consequences for quite some time. And also the point that Tony makes is that the poorest in society are not the ones that are causing climate change. But the climate change the retrofit agenda can provide an answer to some of the fuel poverty questions. So thanks very much for that. Anyone else? Okay, we've got a few. Robert and then Sheena.
Sorry, I was just figuring out the settings there on the menus. Finding the hand isn't the only issue for me. I think, sorry, Robert McBean from Sustrans. I think I welcome the fact that you've pitched this as being a sort of a broad-based approach. That suits us absolutely fine, because the collection of sustainable and active travel partners have already formulated a specific kind of sectoral manifesto. But that all sits within wider regeneration issues. For us, there's no point just investing in walking, wheeling, and cycling on its own if you're not also improving public transport, if you're not also addressing, climate change, the fact that green and blue infrastructure needs to be brought into a lot of areas. We've got to deal with issues around flooding, tree coverage, all those kind of issues. The whole package needs to be pushed for. And we think SURF's certainly in a position to be able to do that, on our behalf, with us kind of supporting and coming in behind it. So it's just to give you a thumbs up and go, yeah, we're quite happy with that direction and those choices. And yes, I'm delighted to hear you say, about sustainable transport being the thread through so many other issues. We've described it similarly as well. Mobility, getting around, is exactly that thing. It's a thing that joins everything else together, and it's how we connect with things as well. I don't know if you can figure that into the language of it somehow, but it's a glue, it's a thread that brings all these other issues together and sits within them.
That's great, Robert. And what I haven't said is we will be looking at everyone else's manifestos and linking to them where we think they are specifically good examples of things that we are wanting to kind of foreground. So that's not just things that may sit within those four big titles, but there will be subsets to them that we think are worth pushing forward as well. Sheena. And if you want to, thank you very much for everyone saying where you're from without me even asking so, but if you want to introduce yourself and say whereabouts, what organisation you're representing.
Yeah, so I work for New Cumnock Development Trust in East Ayrshire. My perspective is obviously very grassroots, and that's, I suppose, my main point is not to lose sight of the community-led element of this, the genuine grassroots community-led element of it, particularly around housing and transport. I recognise that we do sometimes get credit and people want to work in partnership with us for some of the kind of hands-on stuff around crises and regeneration, but things like housing and transport, it feels like it's out of our reach. And it's very much, certainly where I work and where I live as well, it's very much on local groups' agendas to tackle housing and transport. So I did notice on the attendance list that there's a lot of local authority or kind of bigger organisations, if you like, with a bigger geographical reach than mine. And for us, our geographical reach is a very small community, but we do need the bigger organisations to work with us, perhaps more for us than as the people in charge, to help solve these issues. Just as an example, Newcomer Development Trust has been working with other development trusts along the A76 to look at sustainable transport for the past 3 years, and the kind of lead partner in that was Community Energy Scotland. At the moment, it's paused because there's no funding to continue taking it forward. So the initial stages were around looking at the communities themselves and what's important to them, but we were hoping that it would lead on to improvements in infrastructure for sustainable transport across communities living on the A76. And that being their main route and the related train line as well. So, there has to be some kind of connection there with organisations that work across that nationally, because for us as small communities, there's not a lot we can do without that input. And it feels a little bit similar around housing. I know where I work, and to a certain extent where I live, there is a desire for better housing from local people, but it has to be under their control, because there is a sense that if whether it's local authorities, housing association, or private developer comes along and puts lots of new housing there, that there's no control over who gets to live there. And that's not something that communities are particularly happy about. So that element of local control guiding whatever is happening I really hope that that's not going to get lost in this.
Thank you very much, Sheena. I know it's not, and I would say it was one thing that came up in our notes from our meeting with the expert advisory group, was making sure that we foreground the grassroots element of it, and the grassroots element of it, we will hopefully be able to tie it into the kind of local democracy aspect of it.
Yeah.
Some of the local democracy work, which again, Scottish Community Alliance have published their manifesto, and it was in their bulletin this morning. It's also worth looking at, and that's the main aspect of their manifesto. It's making sure that that meaningful engagement is across all sorts of things. And I would agree that those two big ticket items, housing and transport, often sit outside of anybody's control. And I think sometimes local authorities will even think it maybe particularly around transport, it might sit outside theirs. But we would strongly agree that it is having communities involved in that. And I think the housing allocation, the reflecting on recent SURF award winners who tend to be for the housing category, who are small scale, and I mean small scale of about 6 to 10 houses, they have control over who has a priority for those housing, and it's hyper local. It's set up in a very hyper local sense. Which, when you get to a settlement that's of your size and you come in, it becomes slightly different. But we can certainly see the tensions that exist there. So the grassroots element is something that we will definitely be stressing. That element of control around the planning, management, implementation of those sorts of things is something that we will stress. But thank you very much for bringing it up. Kieran.
There. Yeah, Kieran Brogan. I'm from the Sandy Development Trust. Sandy is one of the outer Northern Isles in Orkney. And actually, as a development trust, we're responsible for delivering a lot of housing and transport services on the island. But something that from the manifesto that sort of lodged with me, I've written comments all over it, was the community wealth building aspect, because on itself, it seems like a really good initiative and incentive, and it certainly is gaining a lot of traction. It comes up in a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions, a lot of sort of workshop things that I'm attending at the moment. But a bit like the short-term let policy, that came in a couple of years ago, it's a very fragile. I think we all know how fragile all of these things are interconnected, and you pay a bit of attention in one area and you sort of whack it down, things pop up in the other area. And community wealth building, as far as I've seen it, is more about the pre-distribution of wealth rather than the redistribution of wealth. So it's talking about businesses being there, which is great in a lot of environments, but not so much on small island environments, because what we saw with short-term lets is we had a perfect model for community wealth building. We had loads of people on the island that, some great characters, some elderly farmers that rented out a room in their house, and that could possibly have been to a work person that's required on the island, or a teacher before they get permanent accommodation. Short-term lets came in and then made that very difficult for individuals to do. So what happened is we lost that huge range of people wealth building. It's now gone over to big businesses that have moved in, and we've got a business on the island now that has got 7 holiday lets, and that's had a dramatic effect, because that's taken 7 houses out of an already desperate situation for housing on the island. And it provides employment to very few people, but it then puts the strain on transport and everything else that associates with it. But that in itself is, in terms of community wealth building, is seen as a good thing. But it's not in this situation. And that's something that really concerns me, because I know that on the Western Isles, tourism is, holiday lets has become a big issue. I see it happening here now. And that is the biggest concern for me, because as a development trust at the moment, we're desperately trying to get a property that we took possession of a couple of months ago that's not in a particularly great state, but we've got a new teacher starting at the school in a couple of weeks, and he can't find any accommodation. So we're desperately running around trying to get this house into some presentable format that he can at least start his job in. But also, from an island point of view, and this goes back to funding particularly, is the difficulties of actually getting trade and contractors to come out to an island. Their life is far much easier served by doing work on mainland Orkney or Scotland. We've actually had to give funding back in the past because we've been awarded funding for projects, but we physically can't get anybody to come out and do it, because it's an 1.5-hour ferry ride each way to mainland Orkney. So if you're a contractor, you've not loaded that one thing you needed on your van that day, you've lost a day's work. So it's a great manifesto. It covers a lot of things. They are all very fragile, interconnected. And as I say, for me, the one thing is community wealth building, because a bit like the short-term lets, I'm sure in cities that's had a positive effect in some ways in the areas that it mattered. But in island locations and very small rural locations, it's actually had the opposite effect, and it's removed community wealth building and now put that into big business that is also then really dramatically, 7 houses for, and that's just one company, 7 houses for holiday lets on a small island with only 200 houses in the first place is a real problem for us.
Thanks very much, Kieran. That's really interesting to hear that. It's the challenge of unintended consequences of national policy and how they operate at local level, and things not being taken into account. I obviously don't know the details of it, whether or not the local authority could handle it, the management of the short-term let licensing differently. I'm based in Edinburgh, and obviously the short-term let issue here, it plays out in a very different way. Nonetheless, there are a large number of collectively of single owner multiple properties. I think so. I recognise that as a pattern, but that's really helpful to know. I should maybe add on the community wealth building, because it does get mentioned within some of the research on the manifesto. It was seen as, at that time, its future was unsure, because I think this was before the draft bill was published. And so there was a nervousness about what the future of community wealth building meant. Obviously, the bill has been published, and there was a consultation on it. And it will be interesting to see how that pans out. And I suppose whatever happens and any amendments that need to be made to it may need to reflect some of the issues that you've just raised around being able to apply it in a way that's specific to certain areas. Because if it's reading as community wealth building, if this activity reads as community wealth building for Sandy and it's not actually community wealth building, that's problematic, which is around data gathering and data usage. But that is very helpful to hear that. I would say, although the bill has been published, community wealth building, with the reshuffling of the Scottish Cabinet, it does. I think it sits with the Deputy First Minister now, but previously, obviously, it had a dedicated minister to it, which obviously gave it some profile. And I think that those shifts have also given some nervousness to what the future of it is. Fergus.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Fergus Murray. I'm work with Argyll and Bute Council. I'm suppose seen as the enemy by many. I'm in charge of economic development. I'm in charge of housing. I'm in charge of planning.
No, you're not seen as an enemy in this space.
But I've always been a long supporter of SURF. And, in terms of the manifesto, there's nothing in it you could argue with. I think, though, the pace of change is such that I think it looks out of date. And I think it needs to be brought up to date with the change that's going on. There's so many drivers going on. You mentioned the short-term lets, and I've been dealing with it, and it's been a complete pain. It was foisted on us from centralised policy making. It was done with the best of intentions to try and deal with a housing crisis, but then when it was implemented, it actually doesn't do that. And what it does, it was also done on the process of making places safer to be or go on holiday. And that's what's impacted on the single room thing and infringing on people's homes, and they've dropped out of the system. But we've actually found out we're getting more and more short-term lets coming in. Anyway, that's another side thing. I think it just you need to take a holistic approach to this and join things up. At the moment, working in government, it's a little bit like whack-a-mole. You solve one thing, and another problem just pops up immediately. Unintended consequences. And so if SURF could look at this coordinated kind of thinking and then look at a focus on preventative action rather than reactive action. There's so many things we could do at a community level to stop people not getting educated or going into health issues or having the wrong housing. How can SURF influence that kind of approach? Because I'll tell you something now, local government is in incredible trouble. I've got to find another £10 million of savings next year after savings that's been ongoing since 2008. And it's the services that help communities thrive that are going to be lost because the vast majority of our funding goes on education and health. And then if you come back to the government, the vast majority of funding goes on health, but it's actually reactive health rather than preventative health through active travel, better housing, etc., etc. So if the manifesto can bring that across, that the need of community action and also policies that adapt to specific areas. My area is completely different to central Glasgow. Yes, we have common denominators of deprivation and people being left out, but there's specific issues in rural areas that need addressed, specific issues in urban areas that need addressed. Government has to recognise that because a lot of their policy looks at a one-dimensional thing as far as I can see, despite the warm words. And one of the things you don't mention as well, and communities don't often think of digital connectivity and access to digital connectivity and affordable digital connectivity through social tariffs or whatever, because that's the future. If you look at the changes in the economy and where the job growth is, digital literacy is vital for people if they want to get into meaningful jobs. As far as I can see it changing really rapidly. There's a lot of things I could ask, and I'm not going to comment on, but I think it needs to be brought up to date with the change. Things are changing so quick that it's quite scary to keep up with it. And the last thing, I suppose, the thing is community benefits. There's a lot of consultation going on by both governments. Community benefits through energy and all that. Why is it voluntary? It should be compulsory. And communities should benefit from it directly. And that's through a compulsory thing to have shared ownership at affordable cost that's funded, or they're basically companies that are taking advantage of our natural assets. I mean, I'm not trying to be political, but extracting a lot of value out of them. Communities should see the benefits of these. And there might be different solutions for urban and rural, but there's still lots of things going on. Why are we pushing our foot in about with voluntary? Because I'm telling you, these companies are fantastic at buttering you up and then walking away. So apologies if there are any of the companies on this call. I deal with them all the time. And, you know, I'm just looking, I'm not trying to stop the investment. I'm trying to let communities get a fair share of that investment, because if communities get a fair share of it, they will welcome it more, and you'll start to see those preventative actions embedding themselves in our communities. So, you know, I'm quite passionate about all of this, and I'm continually moaning to government. And I've also written my own rural manifesto that's going to be sent around rural councils for adoption, about the relation to the rural economy and what we want to see it happen in the rural economy, or else we're toast. So that's my point of view.
No, Fergus, thank you very much. No, that's really helpful and it's constructive. And when you've done your manifestos, you know, make sure you send it to us, because we're very, you know, we're, as much as we will try and limit the number of things that we push, but we're very happy to push other manifestos as well. On your, I mean, I agree, it's a fast-changing environment, and I would say even AI within this year has changed, well, is changing lives and opportunities dramatically. So it's, I mean, I would push back on you slightly in saying, you know, we're viewing a focus on housing and transport as preventative. So that's core to, because we're thinking if we don't address these, you're still then having to deal with health issues that result because of these poor fundamentals that we need in life. And I think a lot of the comments that we got in the work that we did was around poor mental health issues and needing more social prescribing and things like that. But some of the issues are we're not getting, why are people suffering from mental health issues, and it's to do with more fundamentals that need dealt with at a larger scale. So I would say we see both of them as preventative.
I know they are preventative. Skills training is preventative. All these things, but emphasize it in your manifesto.
Yeah.
So that the ethos is you're trying to approach this from a preventative approach rather than reacting to the issues that we've had for decades. You know, we just seems to be repeating itself all the time. When I look at my communities that I work with, the same pockets of deprivation are there and have been there for decades, and we haven't shifted the dial on it, and that needs to change.
I wholeheartedly agree there. So thanks, Jeff. I mean, the thing that you have said that I would say, well, obviously the two other things you said are of high interest. The digital connectivity, I would agree, and that is something that hasn't come up, but I would agree that it is a particularly important aspect, and I think it's a particularly important aspect for outside Central Belt. And so I think that is something that we can definitely take on. The other issue of the community shared ownership of energy regeneration, obviously the current civic discourse around energy regeneration is fascinating. I see Donald Trump has put his tuppence in as he left the country, which obviously some people will support. But there are very complex issues around that definitely need to address, and communities need to be local communities need to be participating in that and have a stronger say in what's happening. But at the minimum, I would say removing the voluntary aspect of the community benefits that the energy companies are delivering would be a very simple ask. But we'll look into that a bit more. And obviously there are other organisations, and Communities Land Scotland are very active in that space, and we will very like to support whatever they put forward within their manifesto. Can I pick up on comments from Susan? You couldn't find your hand, Susan Jones, but Susan, please, rather just be reading it out.
Thank you. So I'm Sue Jones. I'm from Go Girvan Community-Led Tourism. When we first started out, we were heavily involved in tourism. But if you have ever been to Girvan, you will see that a much greater need here is our regeneration. And unless we do something about that, then the tourists will not come to us in any case. So we have switched our focus to regeneration. But one of the important things that we've found, and I'm so pleased that it is in your manifesto, is that democracy matters. Because what we have found here in Girvan is we've got lots of community groups who have been working on all aspects of the needs of the community. But we have recently had a really, really strong team building up in our community council. And they are working really, really closely with all the community groups. And this is now making a massive difference because the community council have the overall picture now of what's required. They're able to get the right support and to be able to talk to departments in the council to get the right sort of support that we're needing. And without the strength of that community council, the other groups really would be struggling. So I think this for us is a really important area, and it shouldn't be ignored because it does give a lot of power to the smaller groups who are working on sort of niche areas. So I'm really pleased to see that in your manifesto.
Good, that's good to hear, Sue. And obviously, I would highly recommend going to Girvan for a holiday. It's lovely. Every time I go, it's been sunny. And obviously, we're aware of the work that's happening in Girvan, but it's also good to hear you say that you're working well with the local authority, and the difference that is making to you as various community groups. So that's positive to hear. But good that you see the Democracy Matters as something that's important to have in our manifesto. Sheena, back to you.
I've just put my note in the chats because I know I've already spoken. I don't want to kind of hog my chance. So there was a couple of things, one around the community wealth building and the importance of community-owned social enterprises and that, but also community benefit funds. It's such a hot topic where I live and work, and making it mandatory does have dangers around that. Putting rules around it. And monitoring those rules that they're being complied with takes away flexibility, takes away recognition that every community is starting from a different point. It's not a level playing field, and they have their own priorities and should be in control of the decision making around those community benefit funds, what they're used for, how they're used. So making it mandatory, it is not a simple solution to anything. It's a very complex issue, and people have very strong feelings about it. Local people who are hosting these wind farms have very strong feelings about it.
Yes, I mean, in wind farms, transmission, now all aspects of any. I mean, the two things that housing, energy generation, and waste disposal, all of which our lives are based on, are all highly contentious. They're all totally necessary to our lives, but they're very contentious because of their siting. And I think, I live in Edinburgh. There was a big campaign to stop an incinerator at Leith for a long time. Personally, I felt that we should have it in Leith because I thought we make the rubbish, we should see what happens to it. It should be in our faces. It may make us ultimately use a bit less rubbish, but then you'd be tied into getting energy and heat from it. But I would agree that these are complex issues that play out differently in different locales. So thanks for the point. Back to you, Kieran.
Yeah, it's just something that I think Sheena touched on, and also Susan, about community groups. I mean, there are so many community groups, whether it's development trusts, community councils, and so forth, and they have a real, particularly from my background with development trust, you have a real understanding of your local community needs, much more so than even the local council. We're part of Orkney, but Orkney mainland has got very different needs and priorities from, one of the islands off it. I think there needs to be more direct support for those community organisations, because quite often, as I said, before, we're providing transport services, we're providing health services, we're providing housing services. But as a community group, you come at the very end of a long chain of ways to get your support. And I think that needs to move up a few pegs, because certainly, in the sort of 6-7 years I've been in this role, I've seen a huge shift, and we're doing so much more now than what I ever imagined a development trust should be responsible for. We're also working much closer together. So as Development Trust in Orkney, we all of us across all of the islands have a fortnightly meeting and catch up and discuss working together on projects. So we're not just raising money for an extension to a community room. We are building houses on Sandy. We're on a project now to build 12 houses for elderly accommodation. But you still feel that you come at the end, and I think there needs to be more recognition that these community groups aren't just a bunch of well-doing volunteers anymore. They are quite evolved and developed organisations. They really understand the needs of that particular community, and they should be much more involved. And it goes back to the funding again as well, because funding pops up. It mentioned whack-a-mole earlier. That's how funding seems to be. Funding pops up, and then by the time you're almost ready to do it, it's already
I wrote
gone.
down whack-a-mole because I thought it was a very appropriate term that Fergus used around a number of things, whether or not it's funding or whether or not it's
It
problems
does.
that arise.
Yeah. So I think community organisations, when we're talking about regeneration, have to have a higher profile in development going forward, because they do have the expertise, they do have the knowledge, they have the resources. They just need, more recognition and support.
That's great, Kieran. Thanks very much. And having done some work around democracy matters and looking at the role of community councils and comparing it with European comparators, obviously small, hyper local government is delivering great services within many countries, but they're resourced and empowered to do those sorts of things. Not always in paid roles, but often with but control over finances and decision making at a scale that is unheard of here. But development trusts and some community councils are managing it within Scotland. Final comment from Linda.
Hiya, I'm Linda Hendry, SURF. So I'm one of Lewis's, Ewan's colleagues, and I'm based in Peterhead. We've got massive projects coming in, a lot of talk about community wealth building there. We're also very much rural. We're based in the northeast of Aberdeenshire, if anyone knows us. So yeah, we have a few tourist bits, but a lot of key topics mentioned: social economy, housing, fuel poverty, digital connection just in general to get in and out. We have no train. Talk about train, you're talking about 20 million. It won't be 20 million. We all know it'll be more like nearly £1 billion by the time everything gets to it. But I think what we all forget is at very initial stages of when there's lots of changes to development. For example, SSEN, Eastern Gate is happening with us in Peterhead at the moment. And it's the fact of, for a lot of the groups, it's the overwhelming urge of what is the best way to look at a plan that, when you have an initial conversation, could be for the next 5, 10, 15 years. And it's ensuring without, I'm going to try and be diplomatic here because I also work part-time for the local authority, which actually helps in my role with SURF. So I've been with SURF longer than my local authority, but it's giving everyone the understanding to say we can look at capacity building, a bit like what Kieran's talked on there in Sandbay. 7 houses taken over of 200 homes is a very mass minority. We've got a lot of derelict buildings here, but the landlord aren't investing in it. So who should pick that up? To me, that shouldn't be the local authority. That should be the landowner. But it's getting the community to understand how things are placed. And it's only when you go to these meetings or read manifests and understand. So I think we're all sort of talking from the same, but it's that overall arch is saying to the community, come forward and tell us. Don't sit behind your keyboards and tap. It's actually having that open conversation. And I mean, I've been trying to break the ice for 2.5 years, Ewan. And when I come to a meeting like this, I like to come into it to hear what everyone says. For Ewan and Emma, Edinburgh, Glasgow, the dynamics are totally different to what we're facing in the Northeast. We're a very, very small fish in a very, very big ocean.
You are, with a huge amount of money kind of coming your direction.
With a huge amount of money,
which
that's
is
scary.
a challenge, yes. And that to me is obviously we're working in Girvan and Peterhead, and the differences are in some ways quite shocking because of the amount of money that could come to Peterhead. With some of the schemes, it's colossal, and how a community kind of gets its head around what that means is very, very challenging. Where Girvan doesn't have that, but there's a lot of activity within Girvan that's really positive. So it's a very they're very interesting places to kind of compare work. So
we're quite opposite, but similar.
But you're both coastal based.
We're both coastal based, but yeah, it's the amount of money coming is, the first tranche, I think, assured of it, is 6 million was requested. 6 million. The town's 19,000 folk. 6 million is a lot of money, and we've already got 20 million sitting with plans for neighbourhood, as well as everything else for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So
Linda, don't over-egg that problem, because I'm sure some people sitting in this room would welcome would welcome the problem of that amount
but
of
it
money.
Is a problem.
But nonetheless, because of our lack of great local democracy, there is a problem there. Okay, it's 11:05. Thank you very much for everyone's comments. Um, I think I was to do a summary. I'm not going to summarize everything that everyone has said. What I am getting is no one has said that those four things are the wrong things that we're focusing on, and that there seems to be an acceptance that we are looking at quite fundamental things, and that while there are niche things that we would all like to see happen, these fundamental things will remain drivers that kind of often prevent these more specialist things, which are good, from happening because we're not able to address them. But you've also given us some things to think about, and also, I suppose, the wording that we have, that we are pitching this as a preventative manifesto. Fergus, thank you very much for making that point. So I think, and that we're wanting to kind of, again, reinforcing to us the kind of grassroots nature of SURF's interests. That, again, I would agree that's very important, and that we don't want that to be lost in the kind of in how we actually present it. We want to make sure that it's, it's the challenge of, I suppose, in some ways, SURF's membership and interests going from grassroots to large local authorities or the enterprise agencies. But I think but it remains important for us, as I said at the beginning, we want communities to be in control of what happens. And it's the responsibility of some of those large organizations to meaningfully engage at that grassroots level. There's no disputing it's the local authorities and enterprise agencies still have their own challenges to be able to do that because it requires time, etc., to do that, and they are subject to the same accounting program of annualization, which is a big challenge within our economic system. So I am really grateful to you all for the time that you've given us this morning, and really helpful and for positive. You're very welcome to contact us directly. Emma, if you put my email address in the
I'll
chat,
there's a follow-up email that has a call out
Right.
and a
So,
link to the recording.
we're very happy to take on, but there's less of a, we are kind of conscious that the chances of us influencing manifestos is a big ask. But we want to make sure that these four topics remain high on agenda going into the election, and that there are topic areas that we will be challenging the parties on, and that we will use within the next Parliament to kind of see how are we faring and looking at those things. If we're not, are these fundamental issues being addressed? If they're not, why are they not being addressed? But to keep pressing whatever future government we have in Scotland on those particular agendas as a preventative measure. So thank you very much for your time this morning. Emma, I haven't agreed this before, but Emma, do you want to come in and give a little pitch for a deadline that's looming?
Yes, I can do that. If you hold on, I'll just swap the spotlight. I'm assuming Ewan is referring to the SURF Awards. So I know there are some SURF Award projects in here, including Sheena's project in New Cumnock. So the SURF Awards are open at the moment, and they close at 5 p.m. on the 1st of September for applications. There's 5 categories, which were the 5 topics that Ewan mentioned: housing and regeneration, investing, place-based regeneration, creative regeneration, community-led, and barriers to employability. So all of the information is on the SURF website. It has a dedicated page. There'll be a link in the follow-up email as well, because I'm heavily pushing the awards just now. I don't know if you can tell. But there's also on that page is a short video from some of our previous winners that give you some top tips about applying. What isn't on there, and people ask all the time, is you can only put one project into one category, but an organisation can put in multiple projects across the categories, because we do get asked that quite a lot. And some people seem to know from the off, but just to say. So the deadline is 5 p.m. on the 1st of September. And if anybody's got any queries about the awards or want to discuss a project, potentially put it into the awards, I'm always happy to have a chat about that. And I'll just hand back to Ewan to close.
Thanks very much, Emma. So thank you very much for your time this morning. Again, feel free to get in touch with us. We have a new member of staff. Augustine is joining us on the 1st of September. He will be leading on policy for SURF, and this will obviously be a major focus for him. Augustine has worked in the Central Belt and on Tiree and on the Western Isles, so he brings a range of experience to SURF, which we think. Emma's based south of Glasgow. I'm based in Edinburgh. We've got Peterhead and Girvan, and so we think somebody that brings an island experience to us is also a positive element here. But we are fundamentally our thinking and is based on what the network thinks. So it's the fact that we have such a wide network with people in very different parts of Scotland and dealing with quite different issues. Your contributions to our discussions are always crucial. That's what we will be basing our manifesto on. So thank you very much for your time today, and enjoy the weekend when it comes. I hope you have good weather wherever you are.
Thank you.